and officially welcome everyone. And let's start off with a blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok divrei Torah. Amen. So near as I can tell, we are in chapter 2, the beginning of chapter 2, and we just completed looking at the seventh day, which was Shabbat, and we talked about Shabbat and how we observe Shabbat, partly Zecher L'Ma'aseh V'Reshit, in memory of the act of creation, and how we make our own Shabbat holy. So are there any further thoughts on that? Because we're going to shift gears beginning in verse 4. No, good. So let's move forward then. So verse 4, these are the generations of the heaven and the earth when God made them. I think we actually had started looking at this verse because we talked about the two names of God that appear together in this verse, Adonai Yud He Vav He, which is the particular name by which the Jewish people address God, the name that is associated with the quality of compassion, and Elohim, the universal generic God, which can be used for any God worshipped by any community of people associated with the midah of justice. So we did talk a little bit about that. And just as a reminder, I was especially fascinated by this comment in the Eitz Chaim, that this combination of the unique personal divine name Yud He Vav He with the general term Elohim appears 20 times in this narrative and only once again in the Torah. This moment is more or less the only time that we hear this term Adonai Elohim. I think that's pretty interesting. And I don't recall actually if I read to you from Sarna. Did we look at, we had you should have that in your packets, the text from Nachum Sarna, who is the subject matter expert on the book of Bereshit, and he wrote this JPS commentary. Many years ago, there was a series called The Anchor Bible, and he was also the author of the volume on Genesis for the Anchor Bible. The JPS Torah commentary is specifically Jewish and of much more recent vintage than the ancient Anchor Bible of my youth. But I wanted to look at his introduction to this section of the Torah reading, because we are moving into a new section. So can someone read for us, the italics say Eden and the expulsion, the human condition. Someone have it there in front of them who could read for us, while God the creator.
I've got it.
Thank you, Barry.
Okay. While God the creator was the primary subject of the previous chapter, the focus of attention now shifts to humankind. This change in perspective and emphasis is signaled by the inversion of the regular sequence, heaven and earth, in the opening sentence. The almost unique expression, earth and heaven, suggests pride of place for terrestrial affairs. Information about the physical world is offered only to provide essential background for the understanding of the narrative, which seeks to explain the nature of man and the human condition.
So that's a really important insight. We're used to the phrase heaven and earth, heaven and earth, heaven and earth. That just rolls off of our tongues. And he's calling to our attention that in this verse we have when Adonai Elohim made earth and heaven. That's one of those things that if it wasn't called to my attention, I think I would just tend to interpret it the way I always hear it. And if I'm not paying very careful attention, I don't know if I would notice that inversion. So good that he points that out to us. that's a significant change, because the focus is shifting from God and God's creation in chapter 1 to now the story of humanity. So the focus is on what's happening on earth. So yeah, thank you, Barry. Please continue.
Chapter 2 is not another creation story. As such, it would be singularly incomplete. In fact, it presupposes a knowledge of much of the preceding account of creation. Many of the leading ideas in the earlier account are here reiterated, though the mode of presentation is different. Thus, in both narratives, God is the sovereign creator, and the world is the purposeful product of his will. To human beings, the crown of his creation, God grants mastery over the animal kingdom. In chapter 1, this idea is formulated explicitly. In the present section, it is inferred from the power of naming invested in man. Both accounts view man as a social creature. Both project the concept of a common ancestry for all humanity. The notion that the human race was originally vegetarian is implied in chapter 2 and earlier in 1. Finally, one of the most serious questions to which the present narrative addresses itself, the origin of evil, would be unintelligible without the fundamental postulate of the preceding cosmology, repeated there 7 times, the essential goodness of the divine creation.
So Sarna is giving us a framework to understand why we have in chapter 2 a review of so many things that we already heard in chapter 1, as far as the concept of the creation, the roles for humanity, the plant kingdom and the animal world in chapter 2. We know biblical scholars, of course, will tell us that the reason that there are 2 different creation versions is because they came from 2 different sources that were welded together. But if we're trying to understand the text as an integrated whole, which is more interesting to me than trying to see which sentence came from which source and how they came together. We've received the tradition as it is, so we look at it as a whole. So he gave us a very good summary there in the second paragraph of what are the elements that are in common between chapter 1 and chapter 2. God as creator, humanity as the crown of creation with some role in oversight of the animal kingdom, the concept of the original human as vegetarian, but also most especially, he says, one of the most serious questions is, so if in chapter 1, every single day we read, and the creation is good, and the creation is good, and the creation is very good, so where does evil come from? And that, of course, is the essential question that any religious faith has to address, is what is the source of evil? Because if we understand God to be good and powerful and caring and all-knowing, then the fact that there's evil in the world requires explanation. And this chapter is going to give us the Torah's explanation for the source of evil. Terry, were you wanting to jump in there?
I'm just thinking about all the conversations I've had with in other groups and situations, and I'm thinking that if good is looked at as a continuum, I think you have the source of evil.
So there are levels of good, and evil is on one side of the. But why is there evil at all? Why is the continuum not good, better, best?
Because we're human and we fail.
Okay, so, but the assumption is that the humans of chapter 1 didn't know from any evil.
All right.
And life could have been pretty good if the Torah ended at the end of chapter 1.
Yeah. Okay.
Sarah Lee?
Well, maybe there's evil so that we could appreciate good more.
So that's certainly
Balance.
that's certainly one explanation. On the other hand, I imagine that those who are on the receiving end of evil might counter that with saying, you know, I could appreciate the good just fine without having to experience the consequences of evil. So I don't know how helpful that is, but this chapter is gonna give us the, you know, of course,
Okay.
the story of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. And let's just finish Sarna's introduction here, Barry, if you would continue.
The startling contrast between this vision of God's ideal world and the world of human experience requires explanation. How did the pristine harmony between God, man, and nature come to be disturbed? How are we to explain the harsh, hostile workings of nature, the recalcitrance of the soil to man's arduous labors? If God ordered man and woman to procreate, why then does woman suffer the pangs of childbirth in fulfilling God's will?
That's not fair.
If God created the human body, why does nudity in the presence of others instinctively evoke embarrassment? In short, how is the existence of evil to be accounted for? The biblical answer to this fundamental question, diametrically opposed to prevalent pagan conceptions, is that there is no inherent primordial evil at work in the world. The source of evil is not metaphysical, but moral. Evil is not transhistorical, but humanly wrought. Human beings possess free will, but free will is beneficial only insofar as its exercise is in accordance with divine will. Free will and the need for restraint on the liberties of action inevitably generate temptation and the agony of choosing, which only man's self-mastery can resolve satisfactorily. The ensuing narrative demonstrates that abuse of the power of choice makes disaster inescapable.
There you go. So
Political
basically,
Torah.
excuse me?
Political Torah.
How so?
Choosing, about choice, about, you know, free will is beneficial only insofar as it's exercised in accordance with divine will, which is the predecessor to your freedom to swing your fist ends before my nose.
There you go. So yeah, so that's going to, of course, be the Torah's answer, is that most evil is a result of humans' choices in the exercise of our free will. So that's where we're going here. And I, before we move on, I wanted to also look at Sarna comments also on this juxtaposition of Adonai Elohim in this verse. He says, he makes, I guess it's basically the same comment that we saw in Eitz Chaim. The combination appears 20 times in the present literary unit, only once elsewhere. It's exceedingly rare in the Bible. The repeated use here may be to establish that the absolutely transcendent God of creation, Elohim, is the same immanent personal God, Yod-He Vav-He, who shows concerns for the needs of human beings. So that's a new point, is that the reason it occurs so much in the creation story is maybe to advertise the fact that these are one and the same, that in we use the term Elohim to describe, let's say, pagan gods, other gods, but when we say Yud-He Vav-He, Elohim, Adonai, Elohim, we are advertising the Jewish perspective that those are one and the same. Admittedly, however, the remarkable concentration of the combination of these divine names in this narrative and their virtual absence hereafter have not been satisfactorily explained. So he gives that answer, but then he says, you know, I don't really like that answer so much. So continuing in the Torah text itself now. So we are in chapter 2, verse 5. And let's look at verses 5, 6, and 7. Is there someone who would like to read basically the next paragraph in the Torah?
I would like,
I'll read it.
Thanks, Early.
No shrub of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. But there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. Then the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul.
Beautiful. Thank you. So I'm reading that through the lens of Arizona experience. So instead of sprinklers, they had that irrigation. You know, the rain didn't come down from the sky. It came up from the earth. Anybody ever lived? My old neighborhood in Mesa, the older homes had those kind of irrigation systems where every once in a while the whole yard would just be flooded with water, and that's the image that's coming to my mind, rather than being reliant on the rain.
still
So
all over in Tucson.
what's that?
There's still irrigation all over Tucson.
Yeah, well, I'm sure.
In Arcadia here.
Yeah, in Arcadia, we had irrigation,
Right, it's still there.
right?
Yeah.
So let's focus on verse 7, which is now the Genesis 2 version of the creation of human being. Adonai Elohim formed HaAdam, the human. So we think of Adam as a pronoun, as a personal name, but it's prefaced here with ha, which in Hebrew is the. So it's the Adam, or more different translation, HaAdam, the human. Afar min ha'adamah, dust from ha'adamah. So you notice the explanation of why is Adam, the human, called HaAdam, because we are created from ha'adamah, from the earth. So that's the correlation. And this foreshadows the Jewish preference for in-ground burial versus cremation, because we say we come from the earth and we return to the earth. We're formed from the dust of the earth and we return to become the dust of the earth, and we shouldn't accelerate or impede that process through cremation. So min ha'adamah also, and God breathed into his nose nishmat chayim, the breath of life. I don't know if anyone has a different translation for.
I have the soul of life.
Ooh, wow, that's.
Yeah, I have the soul of life.
Hmm.
And so
And it's also in stone.
The soul of life. Well, so nishama is clearly one of the words that refers to soul. We have a lot of different terms for soul, nishama, nefesh, ruach, and the Kabbalists will try to help us understand the nuances of all of the different aspects of the
That's
soul.
good.
But nishama, which you might know from the Yiddish pronunciation, neshama. Sometimes we'll say of somebody that they're a gita neshama, right? They're a good soul, right?
Yeah.
So neshama, soul, it's related. This aspect of soul is related to nishima, which is breath. So there's very that connection that our breath is what makes us a soul, And when our last breath leaves our body, then our soul departs. And I often conversely say, when I'm with people who are converting to Judaism and they come out of the mikveh after their last dunk and take their first breath, they're breathing in a Jewish soul in that moment. And Lisa put some kind of a comment here. Jonathan Sachs comments on the creation of humans. Ruach Memalala. So yes, so
Sounds like Ruach Mamala, the Mamala.
yeah,
It's-
right. It
It's
does.
your mother's
It's a hard
soul. It's
word
your
to say,
mother's soul.
but telling, speaking, so I'm just, I'm flashing on Hanukkah is coming up this week. So what's one of our famous Hanukkah songs? Mi Yimalel V'Rot Yisrael Otani Yimna, right? Who
Yes.
can retell the things that befell us? You know that song? Somebody,
Yeah.
right?
I remember
So-
that.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's the root that Sachs is quoting. Mi Yimalel, who can retell? So Ruach Memalala, a telling, a speaking. So I think Sachs is suggesting there that the ability to speak is part of what makes us essentially human.
And I think it's interesting too that he uses the phrase speaking spirit.
Ruach is,
Yeah, so even though what we see here is, human beings becoming corporeal, we still have that that intangible, that spirit, that even though we speak in this world, we still have a connection outside of it, I guess.
and what we like to think that we are so different from other creatures in the world because of this capacity to speak. And yet I think we're also learning, as science is advancing, that other species do have mechanisms of communication, that the deficiency may be in our ability to understand those communications, not so much in their ability to communicate. I'm thinking of whales specifically, but I don't know if other people are aware of other examples, but it seems to me that I read occasionally about how we're learning more about how other species communicate.
There.
Which,
certain plants communicate as well.
yes.
And
Just
that-
like in the Hobbit.
Yeah, I haven't read The Hobbit, but somebody was telling me recently about how trees are able to communicate through
Yes.
through their roots.
Yes.
Who was that? Who was?
I know you and I have talked about that. And also the ground vegetation in rainforests does the same thing in relation to the trees.
Right, that if one tree is missing a certain nutrient, that the other trees
Yeah.
can sense that and help bring that nutrient through the tree to the other trees. And gosh, there was a book someone recommended to me recently that that made this point, and I neither remember who made the recommendation or the name of the book, but I remember the point that they were bringing forth. And they said that even if one tree is not getting enough light, that the other trees will tend to grow away from that tree to allow more light to come to that tree. So it's really fascinating. And it does beg the question, though, of this vegetarian, vegan thing that, if we like to think that animals maybe are more sentient, so we shouldn't eat them. But if the broccoli is screaming when we're cutting it off the stalk, then I'm really at a loss as to what we're supposed to be eating.
And
David-
roses are territorial.
Uh,
Roses are territorial. You can't, if a rose bush dies, you can't plant another rose bush in its place. It will not survive.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So what do you do?
Plant something else. What I've done when a rose bush has died is I've removed the dirt and I used it in another part of the garden and I put new dirt in.
Wow. You have to psych out the rose bush. David?
Well, following Owen's comment, back to good and evil, trees will put out when they drop their leaves, put out chemicals that inhibits and or will kill other plants from sitting in their area. So they're practicing a form of genocide on other trees. So if you want to try play with good and evil, at what point does a tree protect itself becomes evil to another tree? So have fun with that one.
So how do you explain, we have this tree, it wasn't a tree, a big plant in our front yard that was dead. I mean, the gardener tried to bring this thing back to life in every way possible and just nothing was working. He pulled it out, pulled the roots out, the whole works. And we just said, leave it alone and we'll figure out what to do with it. All of a sudden now we have a vine growing there, not related, doesn't look like or related to the plant that was there, but it's a whole new breed of something that is growing in that spot.
Well,
called a weed.
Plants have their own toxicology.
That sounds like a weed.
Yeah.
So
No, it's
plants
not.
have-
It's not a weed.
What
We
are they
just haven't
doing?
Figured out this isn't a weed. It's something that's growing into something.
Well, maybe it blew over from a neighbor.
Yeah.
or-
Who knows how? this-
Yeah, right. Yeah, we'll figure that one out. Doesn't resemble any neighbor's plants.
Really?
We
Okay.
call those volunteers.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
maybe
okay,
a
thank
bird,
you.
a bird brought the seeds from somewhere else. The question is it something that you would like to have there? Is it something that?
Yes, we just have to figure out how to do it, let it grow and not have it attached to the house. So we have to go buy something like a little
Yeah, something. for-
trellis kind of thing that we can.
Well,
send it through.
that's fun. Volunteers are the best. To borrow Terry's word. I
That's
always
great.
feel like if the plant itself wants to be there, it's gonna flourish more than something.
That's right.
That we
That's
are
what it's doing.
that we are trying to grow in that space. So good. So we're talking about the creation of human beings. We come from the dust. God breathes this soul into us. So the soul, the breath is our connection to our soul and to God. I think that explains why it sounds ridiculous to say, obviously breathing is important for us to sustain our bodies, but in so many forms of meditation, breathing, paying attention to breathing is why breathing as a conscious activity is so centering. It does bring us back to the essence of who we are when we in Musar, where
I was just going to say in meditation,
yes,
that's, you go back to the breath.
absolutely, the breath. And in Musar, so many times we find that when we want to connect with the midah that we need in the moment, that rather than reacting viscerally, if we can pause and take a breath before we react, and that's going to be connected to where we're going in this chapter and where Sarna set us up about the human capacity to make choices and how that is part of our being made in the image of the divine, and it's the source of good and evil. And when we take a breath, it facilitates our making better choices because we are able, we might be able to connect those two ideas actually and say that when we take a breath, we connect with our divinity. God breathed the breath of life into us and maybe helps us get back in touch with our better nature and better able to make positive choices between good and evil. So there may be a connection there. I want to talk about this business of Adam. Is this a male human who is being created here. Remember in chapter 1, male and female, God created the human. In chapter 1, the creation of human beings was specifically male and female simultaneously. And we talked about the whole myth of that original being hermaphroditic and then eventually being separated into male and female elements. But the sense here is that in this verse, we're talking about a human, but not a particular gender. So I wanted to look at the women's Torah commentary, which you should have, pages 10 and 11. And I wanted to look at, you can see at the bottom of page 10, commenting on verse 7. There's a couple of comments, but then a longer section that begins with the man. The word Adam functioned in verse 5 is its usual role as a collective noun, designated human beings of both genders. As also earlier in 1:26-27 and later in 5:1 and 2. But now in chapter 2, verse 7 through chapter 3, verse 30, HaAdam, the Adam, refers to a particular individual. And this second creation story is ambiguous with respect to this person's gender. Some of you were not here in Leviticus. We looked at a very interesting section from Leonard Felder's book, We See It So Differently, where he talks about different Talmudic texts about gender and the various genders that are reflected in the Talmudic text, as the Talmud, the rabbis were observers of the human condition and discerned that between male and female there was, as Terry said, a continuum. So this second creation story is ambiguous with respect to this person's gender. On the one hand, it can be presumed that early readers understood HaAdam to designate the first human being as male. All patrilineages originated in this first human being, and in biblical genealogies, the typical initiator of any lineage is male. In other words, as David Stein suggests, HaAdam in this story functions as an etiology not of human biology, but rather of lineage. This presumption works well with the narrative flow in which even after the creation of woman, the term HaAdam continues to be used to refer to the man. So one possible understanding, HaAdam means Adam, the man. According to this view, woman in terms of lineage, but only in those terms, is indeed presented as second and derivative.
I don't understand why Judaism then is handed down through the mother.
Judaism being handed the matrilineal descent is from a very practical perspective, Terry. And that
I understand that, but I don't understand how that fits with this concept of lineage. And I guess it's because it's, you know who it came out of. You don't know
A,
who
you
put
know
it
who
in
it
there.
came out of, and B, I also think it's a recognition that if for the most part, it's the woman who's creating the religious environment in the home that is going to influence the child. And I see that there's a comment in the chat. Is that Lisa? Oh, no, that's Terry. Terry, I can't remember who said it, but a therapist I used to see had this taped to her coffee table. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. Yes, very, very true. In the Musar literature, we say between the match and the flame. What we're trying to do is open up the space between the match and the flame. So so the man comes first, the man is prior, the woman is somewhat of an afterthought, one way of looking at it. Nonetheless, this story presents, as Phyllis Bird notes, a portrait of humankind in which the two sexes are essential to the action and are bound together in mutual dependence. On the other hand, when viewing the individual designated by the term Adam, the usual inclusive meaning of that term cannot be ignored. So Adam being human, not being a pronoun or male. A gender neutral or non-gendered progenitor was not unknown in the ancient world. It appears, for example, in Sumerian literature and in the work of Plato. Plato's Symposium describes humans as not gendered initially, but divided later into 3 types of pairs: man and woman, man and man, woman and woman. The Greek myth thus accounts for different sexual affinities as persons seek their specific other half. In Genesis 2, the generic term in the text creates ambiguity regarding that character's gender. This Adam is at the same both the single individual and the human being. So both male and also generic human. That's a little hard to understand. Through this gender ambiguity, the text seems to be expressing complex ideas about the position of female and male in God's plan and about the tension perceived in cultural reality. The immediate emphasis falls on the earthiness of the person, Adama, meaning earth. So I just, I wanted to also comment that Phyllis Tribal, who is a non-Jewish biblical commentator, suggests, so the Women's Torah commentary had said that, described the woman as being derivative because the male is created first and then the female second from the male. Phyllis Tribal invites us to consider that the creation is building from the most basic to the most complex, and that one might consider actually that the female is the pinnacle, having been the last thing to be created rather than being derivative, that if we're building in levels of sophistication and the woman is the last thing created. So,
So
the whole other conversation happening in the chat here. Let's see, you know.
Go with that, yeah.
Yeah.
We'll move on.
David, why don't you read us what you wrote here? Oh, you're just back to the plants.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us. This looks interesting. Where's David?
Oh, right here.
Yeah.
It's like plants will share or not share. Like Owen said, roses will not accept other plants, but if you put nightshades or other plants of a different species, it'll grow finely. Whatever plant nurtured in the place where the plant was taken out, it may have found root, foods, fungus that it can use quite easily, and the volunteer grows there. And that's how forests reclaim themselves, because some find the nutrient first that they can share and grow, and other ones hoard it. When you're doing tomatoes, you can't put peppers and eggplants nearby because the root systems are incompatible. So plants will hoard and or share the soil. The Palo Verde and the Saguaro are a prime example of plants that will nurture. They'll nurture one for the other, but it won't work with the cholla. It's just the way plants are. And people are the same way. We nurture some and not others. And the same thing with wolves and other forms of communications. Certain ants will share and symbiote. Other ants are predatory. We're all part of the same kind of cycle of sharing and or predatory. And I think people just don't see that at times.
It's just so fascinating, David. Thank you. And the question then for me is, so human beings, we believe, can think and grow and learn and do teshuva. So perhaps for whatever biological reasons, I'm not attracted to this individual and therefore I'm not going to nurture them. Can I, as a human being, make a choice to overcome that hardwiring that I may have for whatever reason and choose to override that circuit and say, I am going to make a decision to nurture this person, maybe because I know that it's a mitzvah to do so, even if my natural inclination is not to do that. And then I would posit that in the natural world, let's say, as you're describing among animals and plants, that there is not that same opportunity to override our pre-programmed nature, so that a saguaro and a palo verde can't get together and say, oh, this poor choya, even though our nature is not to care for the choya, we are going to care for it anyway. So that's, I don't know, David, if you have a response to that.
Yeah, it's the question is, and it's not simple. There is many things of fungus, biology, there are minerals involved. Some things can work together, some things can't. The bean, the melon, and the corn work beautifully together to provide living for each other and helping each other. But sometimes people are doing the same way. You look at the groups that are asking for money for their charities. Some of these groups are absolutely wonderful, but you take those same behaviors and you can turn it into political behavior. You can turn it into diplomatic behavior. It can be both good and evil. I lived in the same apartment complex as a man named Ted Bundy. So
What?
that name should ring some bells.
Woo!
Now,
What a
he-
claim to fame.
Yeah, not fun. Evil, absolutely. But then when you come to the punishment, what is a greater punishment? A death penalty or being locked into a small cage without socialization for the rest of your life? What do you get? A man who can read or see people once in a while, or a man trapped in a cage? Which is a greater punishment? Which is better? Which is good? Which is evil? And when we say we know the difference between good and evil, my studies of history show that there has been so many shades of good and evil that, thank you, I don't know what the answer is many times. I know my own personal reaction, but sometimes I have to stop and think. Is it my reaction? Is it my intellect? Or where do I say, my fist is not going to stop at Barry's nose? No offense to Barry's nose. But I don't know. I honestly don't know where evil starts and being good ends at times, because it's such a mixture of gray. And
I want to highly recommend a book by Rushworth Kidder called How Good People Make Tough Choices, or When Good People Make Tough Choices. And it's a Rushworth Kidder, Kidder. I'll make a note to, let me just make a note to send you some information about that.
I know for protecting my family, that's fairly easy. And maybe my tribe, that's fairly easy, but sometimes you start asking questions.
So Kidder's thesis is he says the hard choice is usually between competing goods more so than between good and evil. He said, good and evil, it's easier to know the difference between good and evil. He posits 4 what he calls dilemma paradigms, like justice versus mercy is one. I think long-term and short-term is one, and that the harder decisions come in the realm of when we have competing goods in those categories. I gave a sermon about this a number of years ago. I'll send it to you because that will give you kind of a summary in just a couple of pages. But it's an interesting idea that our challenges are not so much between good and evil, but more subtle than that, which is, I think what you're saying, David, is it's not.
It's available on Amazon in paperback or Kindle.
There you go. I thought it was really, it was a memorably great book.
I just bought it on Kindle.
Wow.
That fast?
I get no, I get no commission on this.
All of
I want to
$8.
go back here because we have a very rich text thread going here this morning. Felix, can you say more? I have no idea what this means. Robert Woodworth posited first the difference between
yeah, that was in response to Terry's asking. I'm not sure who said this first, but it was a psychologist by the name of Robert Woodworth who said
between stimulus and response,
that between stimulus and response there is organism,
which is
a processing, thinking, emotional and cognitive, the thing we refer to as the human.
Thanks, Felix. I knew you would know who said it. I think this was a slight change in it, and I think it was somebody else that was quoted, another psychologist though.
Yeah.
I know it was a psychologist who said it, but
yeah.
The space in between was the space that you just defined, Rabbi. It was the pause. The fact that we have a choice is right there in that little nugget.
Yeah,
right.
it's the space between our ears.
Right. So, you've heard me quote many times Charles Swindoll, who said that life is 10% what happens to me and 90% how I react to it.
You're right. Yeah, that's true.
Another way of making the same point, I think. Let's see. I think Elisa wants to play devil's advocate here, so I'm going to give her the floor in just a moment. I wanted to also mention Kat and Michelle sent a note to me that they have a more recent version of the Torah commentary that is actually quite different. So that's interesting. But Kat and Michelle, you said it makes essentially the same point, but the language is different.
Funny. Was that coming into you?
Roughly, it's hard to follow along with both as you were reading, I was following on in ours or trying to, and I'm like, where is this? So I went and found the handout and I'm like, oh, all right.
Yeah, my version, I didn't realize that there was such an updated version. Mine was published in 2008. It's not that long ago.
Huh.
But anyway, where's Lisa Kaiser? Oh, Lisa's blanked out. Lisa, what's your perspective here?
Well, we talk about making choices, to love our neighbor. And my only response to that is sort of, I said, our visceral negative reaction to someone may be a survival strategy. And should that be ignored? Is that visceral negative reaction not God-given? So, I wonder about that balance between our God-given survival instincts and making choices that may counter that.
Yes. So, right. If we weren't programmed to experience fear and apprehension, we might get ourselves into situations of danger. So, learning to pay attention to our instinct is, definitely a survival strategy. But so that may be an initial response. So then the question becomes, as we, I'm a little concerned in this moment. I'm taking a step back. I'm feeling defensive, but then we also have the capability to process. I think, yes, that capability is instinctive. But, look, our whole culture is struggling now with racism. So is our fear of someone who looks different from us based on experience? Is it based on cultural stereotypes? And, that is, that is a racist phenomenon that we experience. Do we get scared more scared if we see someone who's Black or brown, to put it bluntly? And is that God-given, or is that socially programmed? Where does that come from?
Mhm. Yeah, I wasn't thinking of it so much as racial, I guess, as just, it's almost a chemical, so deep and visceral and primal sometimes, that, it's outside of culture. It's a totally biological response.
But Steve Haas is suggesting in the chat that we don't all have those same instincts, and that may be a visceral response that is not mandated in the situation. Is that essentially what you're saying, Steve?
Yeah, what may be a survival response based on what one person sees or feels, it may not necessarily be the same for someone else. I don't know that there is one human visceral response to anything, basically.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that too, that I think one of the things working against trusting that instinct too much is how much our environment and our nurturing has created that response.
Right.
Because a lot of those responses that we have are created by the demons that are imposed on us.
They're socially conditioned.
Yeah.
Not
Sorry. There is one fundamental reaction, which is fight or flight. And that one view of civilization, one view of mental health is the ability to interpose thought between fighting or fleeing, and that's true in all interactions between people, the world, etc. That the separating the impulse from the action is a form of mental health, and knowing why you're separating it. And that's in part the focus of Musar, obviously, but I think it's also the focus of parenting and of socializing, that if kids were not taught how to do that, whoever was the biggest brute would probably be the president of the class. But thought is used to change behavior.
This best song that was not in the play but added for the movie from South Pacific. You've got to be carefully taught
to hate
Right.
and fear. You've got to be.
It was in the movie.
Year to year.
It was
in the movie, not in the play, original play.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And
wait, Kathy Darrow pulled out, the beautiful statement of this concept that we're discussing from Viktor Frankl. Thank you for reminding us of that, Kathy. Do you want to read that?
I will absolutely love to read that. That's one of my favorite all-time quotes.
It's beautiful.
Thank you. I'm
between
grateful.
Stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies our freedom and our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom.
It's so beautiful, and even more powerful when we think about the context that he's writing about. Viktor Frankl, the formulator of logotherapy, who was in a concentration camp, I want to say in Auschwitz. And if you have not read Man's Search for Meaning, it's on my list of, just top 5 books of all time that every human being should be required to read. It's not a graphic Holocaust book, and it's not a long book, but it's incredibly rich. And he talks about his experience in a concentration camp, and that the last human freedom that cannot be taken away from us is the freedom to choose our attitude in any given situation. And it's just an absolute must read. So thank you so much for that. So that was verse 7. And now moving into chapter verse 8 and following. Now we're going to get the geography and topography of the Garden of Eden. So Adonai Elohim planted a garden in Eden in the east and placed there HaAdam, ambiguous, the human, or the man, whom God had formed. And from the ground, Adonai Elohim caused to grow every tree that was pleasant to the sight and good for food. So here is again the argument of the vegetarianism. Remember in chapter 1, we had, the whole world was vegetarian. Everything, even the animal kingdom, was insisting on the herbs and the vegetables and fruits. And here again, every tree that was pleasing to the sight and good for food, with the tree of life in the middle of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil, Tov Vara. And you remember we had seen, I'll just put the term up in the chat again, we had seen the term merism. Remember we had talked about that. Heaven and earth means everything, heaven and earth and everything in between. Man and woman and everything in between. And we might understand Tov Vara in the same way, good and evil and everything in between, as Barry said earlier, Barry Kipnis, the continuum of good and evil. And then verses 10 through 14 are gonna tell us about the rivers and what grows there, what each land is familiar with. And you'll pick up there next week. Rabbi Chernow is going to be our guest teacher next week. So, she typically is very engaged with our religious school students on Sunday morning, but a couple of times a year, she likes to connect with this group. So I trust that you will be gracious and kind to her, and also make a special effort to be there to support her. So with that,
won't be mean to a substitute teacher.
Yeah, don't be mean to the sub. No spitballs and paper airplanes.
Oh crap! Takes all the fun out of it.
So, I wish everyone a wonderful Hanukkah, lots of light and latkes, and however you choose to celebrate, stay safe. And I look forward to seeing you then in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Shalom, Bimromav.
Thanks, everybody.
Shalom.
Aleinu v'al Yisrael. Amen. Out.
Have a good